Iran did not lose this round because it was weak. Iran lost this round because the one strategy that kept it alive for years finally stopped working. That is the story. Not merely that the United States rejected a ceasefire, not merely that Iran took catastrophic military losses, not merely that mediators failed to close a gap. Deeper story is that the Islamic Republic kept trying to run the same threshold strategy after the battlefield had already changed. So radically that the strategy no longer protected it. That is the axis. For years, Iran's real weapon was not just enrichment, missiles, or proxies. It was time, delay the deal, delay the decision, delay the final military threshold, use negotiations to buy space, use buried facilities to preserve capability, use regional networks to spread risk, use ambiguity to make everyone else hesitate. That was the formula. And the entire regime came to believe that formula would always work. That is why the ceasefire offer failed so decisively. According to the source material, the Americans did not simply hear Iranian demands and decide the terms were too high. They walked away because they believed the Iranians were still trying to preserve the same strategic formula underneath the language of peace. That is a completely different kind of rejection. Once Washington believed that underground activity was resuming, while Iran was simultaneously signaling seriousness through intermediaries, the negotiation changed meaning. It was no longer about whether Tehran wanted more leverage at the table. It was about whether Tehran was still using the table itself as cover. That is why the room broke. And once the room broke, the whole crisis shifted from, can this war be paused? Can the old Iranian system be allowed to survive in anything like its old form? That is a much bigger question, and it cannot be understood apart from what happened on the 28th of February. The U.S.-Israeli campaign did not just damage Iran, it changed the structure of Iranian power. Commanders gone, intelligence chiefs gone, missile and naval figures gone, layer after layer of the regime's military security architecture cut open. Then, above all of them, the removal of the supreme leader from power. That is not just another casualty in a war. That is a strike against the organizing principle of the state, because the Islamic Republic was built around one final arbitrator once that figure disappears. Every unresolved tension beneath him rises to the surface at once: succession authority, bargaining power, factional control, the right to negotiate, the right to concede, the right to refuse. That is why what followed has looked so unstable. Not because instability after war is surprising, because this is instability inside a regime whose old command logic has been ruptured from the top down. That is the part a lot of coverage still misses. This is not just military degradation. It is political decapitation followed by strategic fragmentation. And the signs are already visible: field commanders threatening open defection rank, and file members reportedly fleeing across the Afghan border. Public attempts to project resilience paired with accidental admissions of how catastrophic the losses really were. Private outreach through mediators paired with public denial. That pattern tells you something essential. Iran is still performing strength, but it is no longer certain that the performance can hold. That is why the phrase performance of strength as a substitute for strength matters so much. Here for decades, the Islamic Republic survived by making people believe in the durability of its defiance. Now, the internal structure behind that defiance is visibly breaking, and once that happens, the system becomes both weaker and more dangerous. Weaker because cohesion starts to thin, more dangerous because the factions still holding power understand that if they lose relevance now, they may lose everything. That is why the ceasefire problem is not simply procedural. The U.S. is asking for dismantlement, handover, and strategic transformation. Iran is still demanding recognition, relief, and continuity. Those are not just different terms, they are different futures. Washington is trying to close the era of the Iranian threshold state. Iran is trying to preserve enough of that threshold state to say it survived the war. That is why one more meeting was never going to be enough. Now look at Hormuz. Hormuz is not a side note. It is the last great concentration point of Iranian leverage. The regime may be damaged, but the strait still matters. A fractured state can still hold a dangerous choke point. A wounded leadership can still threaten the route through which a huge share of global energy flows. That is why Hormuz is now so central. The weaker Iran becomes in broader terms, the more important Hormuz becomes in political terms. But that reveals something darker. The more a regime depends on one dangerous card, the more it shows how much of its old strategic depth has already disappeared. That is what late-stage leverage looks like, not broad power, not confidence. A narrowing set of tools becoming more explosive because so little else is left. That is exactly where Iran is. Now, its old formula is broken. Delay is no longer protecting it. Buried infrastructure is no longer protecting it. The supreme leadership principle is no longer protecting it. The diplomatic room is no longer protecting it. What remains is a wounded state trying to preserve enough continuity to survive while the world around it increasingly treats that continuity itself as the problem. That is why this moment is so significant. We are not just watching a ceasefire fail. We are watching the end of the strategic model that let the Islamic Republic survive for years in the gray zone between diplomacy and force. The threshold strategy is dying. The only question now is what dies with it and what still survives on the other side.